The shuttle descended through the clouds toward the massive orbital station that hung above Earth like a silver crown. Maya Johnson pressed her face against the small window and watched as the structure grew larger with each passing second. She had seen pictures of the Coalition station before everyone on Earth had, but seeing it in person made her stomach flip with nervousness and excitement. The station was home to representatives from 47 different alien species, each one more advanced than humanity could ever hope to be. At least that was what everyone said. Maya pulled back from the window and glanced at the 5 other students sitting in the shuttle. They were all from Harvard, just like her, but they were different in ways that mattered. Brandon Lee sat in the front row with his expensive leather jacket and confident smile. He had published 3 papers on quantum mechanics before his 20th birthday. Katie Morgan was typing on her tablet, probably reviewing advanced calculations. Her family had donated an entire building to Harvard. Daniel Price looked calm and collected as always. He had won every mathematics competition he had ever entered. Christopher Hayes and Amanda White sat together, whispering about something. They both came from families where attending Harvard was a tradition going back 5 generations. Then there was Maya. She grew up in Detroit in a neighborhood where most kids did not finish high school. Her mother cleaned offices at night and her father drove a delivery truck during the day. Maya got into Harvard on a full scholarship because she scored perfectly on every test they gave her, but she knew the other students saw her as the alternate, the backup choice, the one who only got invited because someone else dropped out at the last minute. She had heard Amanda whisper to Christopher that it was affirmative action, that Maya probably could not handle the pressure, that she would embarrass them all in front of the aliens. The shuttle docked with a soft thump and the door slid open. A human liaison officer greeted them with a nervous smile. He was sweating despite the cool air in the docking bay. He told them that representatives from the entire coalition were waiting to see what Earth's brightest minds could do. The Vorathian Empire had issued a challenge that no species had solved in 3,000 years. If humanity could solve it, Earth would gain respect and power in the galactic community. If they failed, well, the officer did not finish that sentence. He just wiped his forehead and led them down a long corridor. The testing chamber was beyond anything Maya had imagined. The walls were made of some kind of crystal that shifted colors when you looked at it from different angles. Holographic screens floated in the air showing mathematical equations that made her head hurt just from glancing at them. Observation decks lined the upper levels where dozens of aliens watched with their various eyes and sensors. Maya saw a Vorathian for the first time, a being that looked like it was carved from living diamond. She saw creatures with tentacles, creatures with wings, creatures that seemed to be made of light itself. All of them were watching the 6 humans with interest or maybe amusement. A Vorathian stepped forward and spoke in a voice that sounded like wind chimes. A translator device rendered the words into English. The problem they were about to attempt involved calculating faster than light navigation through folded space without using traditional wormhole technology. The mathematics required understanding principles that humanity had not yet discovered. The Vorathian said this with what might have been a smile, though it was hard to tell on a crystalline face. The being explained that they would have 1 week to solve the equation. They could use any resources available in the chamber. They could work together or separately, but they had to succeed or Earth would be marked as a species not yet ready for true coalition membership. The other students immediately rushed to the workstations. Brandon grabbed the largest quantum computer and started entering commands. Katie and Daniel began arguing about which approach to take. Christopher and Amanda set up their workspace together, pulling up research files they had brought from Earth. Maya walked slowly to a small corner of the chamber. She picked up a basic tablet and a stylus. She looked at the main equation floating in the center of the room. It was massive, sprawling across multiple screens written in symbols she had never seen before. For the first few hours, Maya just read the problem. She wrote notes by hand on the tablet. She drew simple diagrams. The other students were already deep into complex calculations. Brandon shouted that he had found a possible entry point. Katie argued with Daniel about quantum field theory. Amanda and Christopher worked quickly, their fingers flying across their keyboards. They all looked confident. They all looked like they belonged here. Maya kept reading. She noticed something strange about the equation. It was not written in one mathematical language. Different sections used different symbol systems. She recognized some human mathematics, but there were parts that looked completely alien. She remembered something her high school teacher had told her once. Her school could not afford fancy calculators or computers, so her teacher taught her to look for patterns instead. He said that math was not about having the best tools, but about seeing the shape of things. By the end of the first day, the other students had covered their workspaces with calculations. They talked excitedly about progress. Brandon predicted they would solve it within 3 days. Maya had filled her tablet with simple notes and questions. She had not attempted a single calculation yet. Amanda walked past and glanced at Maya's workspace. She smirked and whispered something to Christopher. They both laughed. Maya ignored them. She kept reading the problem, looking for the pattern she knew had to be there. The observation decks above remained full. The aliens watched everything. Maya wondered what they thought of humanity. She wondered if they expected the humans to fail. She wondered if they were right. The second day began with Brandon Lee announcing he had made a breakthrough. He gathered the other elite students around his workstation and showed them a complex series of calculations. Maya watched from her corner as they got excited, nodding and adding their own ideas. Brandon said he had found a way to bypass the quantum field equations by using a different mathematical framework. Katie suggested modifications. Daniel added refinements. Christopher and Amanda worked on testing the theory. For 6 hours they worked together with energy and confidence. Maya continued her simple note-taking, watching and thinking. By afternoon, Brandon's approach collapsed. The calculations led to an impossible result where space would fold in on itself infinitely. The energy requirements would destroy any ship that tried to use the navigation system. Brandon stared at his screens in disbelief. He had been so sure. Katie suggested they were close and just needed to adjust some variables. They spent another 4 hours trying to salvage the work. Nothing helped. The approach was fundamentally flawed. Brandon slammed his hand on the desk and walked away to cool down. Maya noticed something during their failed attempt. The way they were trying to solve the problem assumed that space was the same thing for all species. They were using human understanding of physics and trying to force it to work. But the equation itself seemed to suggest something different. The alien symbols were not just different notations for the same concepts. They represented different ways of thinking about reality itself. Maya made a note of this but said nothing. She knew if she spoke up, they would not listen to her. The third day brought more frustration. Katie took the lead this time with a completely different approach. She suggested using probability matrices combined with quantum tunneling theory. The math was elegant and sophisticated. Even the other students were impressed. They worked together again, building on Katie's foundation. Maya saw the pattern repeating. They were brilliant, all of them, but they were all thinking the same way. They were using the best tools, the most advanced theories, the cutting-edge research, but they were still looking at the problem through human eyes only. Katie's approach lasted longer than Brandon's, but it too eventually failed. The equations became unstable at certain points in space. The navigation system would work perfectly in some regions but become wildly inaccurate in others. The ship would arrive at the destination or it would end up on the other side of the galaxy. Katie looked devastated. She had spent 18 hours on the calculations. Daniel tried to comfort her, but she pulled away and sat alone. Maya could see the confidence starting to crack. These students had never truly failed before. They had always been the smartest in every room. Now they were failing in front of the entire galaxy. Maya spent the third day doing something the others thought was crazy. She started learning the alien symbol systems. The Chamber's computer had a database of coalition mathematics. She pulled up the basics of Varathian crystalline math. She looked at Zenthari fluid dynamics notation. She examined Krell-networked calculation methods. She was not trying to become an expert. She just wanted to understand how these different species thought about the same problems. It was slow work. The concepts were strange and difficult. But Maya had learned long ago to be patient. When you could not afford fancy shortcuts, you learned to take the long way. On the fourth day, something changed in the chamber. The confidence was gone from the elite students. They worked quietly now, desperately. Daniel tried another approach using recursive algorithms. It failed within hours. Christopher and Amanda attempted something with fractal mathematics. That also led nowhere. Brandon tried to combine elements from all the failed attempts. The result was an incoherent mess. By evening, the argument started. Brandon blamed Katie for wasting time on her probability approach. Katie shot back that Brandon's breakthrough had been worthless from the start. Daniel tried to calm everyone down, but Christopher told him to shut up. Amanda started crying from stress and exhaustion. Maya watched it all happen. She understood what was breaking them. They had been trained to compete, to be the best, to win. But this problem did not reward individual brilliance. It required something else, something they had never learned. Maya kept working on her notes. She was starting to see the pattern now. The equation was not impossible. It was just written for someone who could think like multiple species at once. It needed someone who understood what it meant to see the world from different perspectives. The fifth day was quiet. The students worked separately now, not talking to each other. The excitement was gone. In its place was grim determination mixed with growing despair. Brandon's calculations grew more desperate and less logical. Katie stopped trying new approaches and just reviewed old work, hoping to find something she missed. Daniel sat staring at the main equation for hours without typing anything. Christopher and Amanda barely moved from their chairs. They looked exhausted and defeated. Maya started writing her actual solution. It began with a simple premise. What if the equation was not meant to be solved using one type of mathematics? What if the answer required combining the different ways that different species understood reality? She started mapping connections between the human sections and the alien sections. She found that Varathian crystalline math described certain spatial relationships beautifully. Xanthari fluid dynamics handled time dilation effects naturally. Krell networking explained how information traveled through folded space. Human mathematics, with its focus on universal principles, could tie them all together. It was rough and incomplete, but it was something. Maya worked through the night while the others slept. She made mistakes and crossed them out. She tried different combinations. Some approaches led nowhere. Others showed promise. She was not using quantum computers or advanced AI. She was just thinking, drawing, connecting dots. The work was hard and her eyes burned from staring at the screen. But she felt something she had not felt since arriving at the station. She felt hope. On the morning of the sixth day, Brandon Lee gave up. He stood up, looked at the equation one last time, and walked out of the chamber. He told the human liaison officer that the problem was designed to be unsolvable, that the Varathians were playing games with humanity. Within hours, Katie and Daniel followed him. They could not take the failure anymore. By evening, Christopher and Amanda also left. Amanda apologized to everyone watching. She said they had tried their best, but humanity was just not ready for this. The chamber became very quiet. The alien observers began to murmur among themselves. The human delegation looked crushed. Earth's great hope had failed. Then Maya stood up from her corner. She raised her hand. Every alien in the observation decks turned to look at Maya. The Varathian elder who had presented the challenge moved closer to the glass. The human liaison officer stared with his mouth open. Maya walked to the center of the chamber carrying her tablet with its simple handwritten notes. Her hands shook slightly, but her voice was steady when she asked permission to present her approach. The Varathian elder studied her for a long moment. Then, with a sound like crystal bells ringing, the being gave permission. Maya started by explaining what she had noticed about the equation. She said it was not written in one mathematical language, but in many. Each section used the notation and logic of a different coalition species. The other students had tried to translate everything into human mathematics and solve it that way. But Maya believed that was the wrong approach. She thought the equation was meant to be understood as it was, with each part keeping its own perspective. The alien observers leaned forward with interest. This was a different path than anyone had tried before. She moved to the first section of the equation and began to work through it using Varathian crystalline mathematics. She showed how the Varathians thought about space as a lattice structure, like a three-dimensional crystal, where each point connected to others in specific patterns. The navigation problem in this framework became about finding paths through the crystal that maintained stability. Maya's explanation was simple and clear. She used basic geometric shapes to illustrate her points. Several Varathians in the observation deck made sounds of approval. She understood their mathematics not as an expert, but as someone genuinely trying to see how they saw. Next, she moved to a section that used Xanthari notation. Maya explained that the Xanthari were aquatic beings who thought about space like water flowing through channels. Time and space were fluid concepts for them, always moving and changing. She showed how their part of the equation described how a ship would flow through folded space, like a current moving through different water pressures. It was beautiful in its own way. The rigid human approach to navigation could never have incorporated this kind of thinking. But Maya had spent days learning to see space as the Zenthari did. A group of Zenthari observers rippled with excitement. The Krell section was different again. The Krell were a networked species where individuals shared thoughts across vast distances. They understood information transfer in ways humans could barely imagine. Maya showed how their mathematics described the communication between different points in folded space. A ship did not just travel through space in the Krell framework. It existed in multiple locations at once, sharing information between those points until the destination became more real than the origin. Maya had struggled with this concept for hours, but she finally understood it by thinking about how she felt connected to her family back on Earth, even though she was in orbit. The connection was real even across distance. Then came the crucial part. Maya began to show how these different perspectives could work together. She used basic human mathematics as the common language that tied everything together. Humans were good at finding universal principles, at seeing what different things had in common. She created a framework where Varathian crystalline stability, Zenthari fluid dynamics, and Krell network connections all contributed to the navigation solution. Each species' understanding covered the weaknesses in the others. Together, they created something complete. The chamber fell silent as Maya worked. She wrote equations on the holographic screens using simple, clear steps. She did not rush or try to show off. She just methodically built her proof piece by piece. The alien observers watched with growing amazement. The human liaison officer had tears in his eyes. Maya worked for 6 hours straight, not stopping for food or rest. Her solution grew across the screens like a living thing, connecting different ideas in ways no one had imagined. There were moments when she got stuck. Some connections did not work the way she expected. But Maya had learned something important growing up poor. When you could not force a solution, you had to step back and look at the problem differently. She would pause, review her notes, and find another way forward. The privileged students who left had never learned patience like this. They expected their brilliance to solve everything quickly. Maya knew that some problems required time and different angles. As evening approached, Maya reached the final sections of the equation. This was where everything had to come together. She showed how a ship using her navigation framework would calculate its path by thinking like all coalition species at once. It would use Varathian math to ensure structural stability. It would use Zenthari principles to flow through space efficiently. It would use Krell networking to maintain connection and position. And it would use human mathematics to unify these perspectives into actionable instructions. The ship would not just travel through space. It would understand space the way each species understood it. Maya wrote the last line of her proof and stepped back. The equation balanced. The solution was complete. She had done it. For several seconds, nobody moved or made a sound. Then the Varathian elder began to make a sound like thousands of tiny bells all ringing in harmony. Other aliens joined in with their own forms of approval. The chamber filled with strange and beautiful sounds. The human liaison officer was openly crying now. Maya just stood there exhausted and overwhelmed, but Maya did not celebrate. She looked up at the observation decks and saw something in the aliens' reactions that troubled her. They were not just approving her solution. They were surprised by it. Some looked almost shocked. She realized that they had not expected any human to solve this problem. They had expected humanity to fail just like the 5 elite students did. The thought made her both proud and sad. Proud that she had proven them wrong. Sad that Earth had to fight so hard for basic respect. The Varathian elder announced that Maya's solution would be reviewed by coalition scientists. If it held up under scrutiny, it would change everything. The elder said something else too, something that made Maya's breath catch. No species in 3,000 years had solved this problem on their first attempt. Most took decades or even centuries to develop the necessary perspective. If Maya's solution was correct, humanity had achieved something unprecedented. Earth's newest and supposedly weakest member had just taught the entire coalition something new. Maya was escorted to a rest area where she finally collapsed into sleep. But even as she drifted off, her mind kept working. She thought about the 5 students who gave up. She did not blame them. They were brilliant and capable, but they had been trained to see the world one way. Maya had learned to see it many ways out of necessity. Growing up between different worlds, between poverty and privilege, between struggle and hope, she had developed a skill the others never needed. She could step outside herself and understand different perspectives. That skill, born from hardship, had just changed the galaxy. Maya woke to the sound of urgent voices outside her room. She had slept for 12 hours, her body finally giving in to the exhaustion of 6 days without proper rest. When she opened the door, the human liaison officer stood there with a huge smile on his face. Behind him were 3 coalition scientists, 1 Varathian, 1 Xanthari, and 1 Krell. They had been verifying her solution all night. The officer could barely contain his excitement as he told her the news. Her proof was correct. Every single line of it held up under the most intense scrutiny the coalition could provide. But there was more. The scientists had discovered that Maya's framework opened up entirely new possibilities. Her method of combining different species' mathematical perspectives could be applied to problems beyond navigation. Communication systems could be improved. Energy distribution could be optimized. Even medical treatments could benefit from seeing biology through multiple lenses. Maya had not just solved one impossible problem. She had created a whole new field of study. The Varathian scientist called it xenomathematics, the mathematics of combining different ways of thinking. The next few days became a blur. Maya was interviewed by representatives from dozens of species. Each one wanted to understand how she had approached the problem. The Varathians were particularly fascinated. Their elder, whose name translated roughly as Crystallix, spent hours talking with Maya about her thought process. Crystallix explained that the Varathians had designed the problem specifically to test for perspective-taking ability. It was not about pure intelligence or mathematical skill. It was about whether a species could think beyond their own viewpoint. Crystallix revealed something that shocked Maya. Every species in the coalition had been given a similar test when they joined. Most failed their first attempt. The Varathians themselves had taken 200 years to develop the necessary perspective. The Xanthari had needed 50 years. Even the ancient Krell had required 30 years of study. Humanity was supposed to be the same. The coalition had expected Earth students to fail, so that humanity would understand they needed to grow and learn. But Maya had succeeded on the first try. In 3,000 years of coalition history, only 5 individuals from any species had ever done that. Maya felt strange hearing this. She asked Crystallix why she had been able to do what others could not. The Varathian elder studied her with eyes that looked like diamonds catching light. Crystallix said that the answer was in Maya's history, in her personal story. The elder had reviewed Maya's background file. Maya had grown up navigating between different worlds every single day. The world of poverty where she lived and the world of education where she excelled. The world of her black community and the world of predominantly white institutions. The world of limited resources and the world of unlimited expectations. Maya had learned young that survival meant understanding many perspectives at once. The other 5 students had never needed that skill. They grew up in worlds that accommodated them, that saw things the way they did. They were brilliant within their own perspective, but they had never been forced to step outside it. When faced with a problem that required multiple viewpoints, they did what came naturally. They tried to reduce everything to what they already understood. It was not a failure of intelligence. It was a failure of experience. Maya had the experience they lacked, earned through years of being an outsider. Crystallix told Maya something else that made her think. The Varathian said that humanity's true strength was not technology or military power. It was diversity. Earth was covered with different cultures, languages, religions, and ways of thinking. This caused conflict and struggle. But it also created individuals like Maya, who learned to bridge those differences. The coalition had been watching Earth for centuries, waiting to see if humans could turn their diversity into strength rather than weakness. Maya had just shown them that humanity could. Back on Earth, the news exploded. Maya Johnson's name was suddenly everywhere. The girl from Detroit who had succeeded where Harvard's best had failed. The media loved the story. Some celebrated her as a hero. Others tried to diminish her achievement, claiming she had gotten lucky or that the problem was easier than reported. Maya watched the reactions from the orbital station and felt tired. She had not solved the equation to prove anything to anyone. She had done it because it was there to be solved, and she saw a way forward. The 5 students who had given up were recalled to the station for a debriefing. Maya saw them for the first time since they had left the chamber. The meeting was awkward and tense. Brandon would not look at her. Katie offered a stiff congratulations. Daniel seemed genuinely impressed and asked her questions about her approach. Christopher and Amanda were quiet, clearly struggling with their own feelings. Amanda finally spoke up and apologized for the way they had treated Maya at the beginning. She admitted that they had seen Maya as less than them, as someone who did not belong. She was sorry. Maya accepted the apology, but she also understood something important. Their attitude was not really about her personally. It was about what she represented. She was proof that the system they believed in, the system that had rewarded them all their lives, was incomplete. They thought success came from having the best resources, the finest education, the right background. Maya showed that sometimes success came from having none of those things, but learning to see what others missed. That realization was uncomfortable for them. The coalition held a formal ceremony to honor Maya. Representatives from all 47 species attended. She was given titles and awards that meant very little to her. What mattered more was the conversation she had afterward with a group of young aliens. They were students like her, from species that had only recently joined the coalition. They told her that they had felt like outsiders, like they did not belong among the ancient and powerful species. Seeing Maya succeed gave them hope. It showed that being new or different was not a weakness. Maya realized something during that conversation. She had spent her whole life feeling like she did not fit in anywhere. Too poor for the rich kids, too smart for her neighborhood, too black for some spaces, too ambitious for others. She had thought of it as a burden. But maybe it was her greatest gift. Maybe not fitting in anywhere meant she could understand everywhere. The question was what to do with that understanding. 1 week after solving the equation, Maya made a decision. She would return to Harvard and finish her degree. But she would also establish a program to find other students like her, students from backgrounds that the system overlooked. She would create opportunities for people who had learned to see the world from multiple perspectives, because they had no choice. The coalition's impossible problem had been solved by someone who spent her life on the outside looking in. Maya wanted to find more outsiders and give them a chance to show what they could do. The human delegation supported her idea immediately. They saw the strategic value. If Maya was right about diversity being humanity's strength, then Earth needed to develop more people who could think across boundaries. The program would be funded and promoted. Maya would have whatever resources she needed. It was strange to her, having power and support after years of having neither, but she accepted it because she knew exactly who she wanted to help. 3 months passed and the galaxy changed in ways both obvious and subtle. The Johnson framework, as Maya's navigation solution was officially named, entered testing phase on coalition ships. The results exceeded all predictions. Travel times dropped by 70% across major routes, but more importantly, accidents decreased almost to zero. Ships using the framework understood space in a more complete way and could navigate safely through regions that had been dangerous before. Trade increased. Communication improved. Barriers between species that had existed for thousands of years began to soften. Maya returned to Harvard but found herself unable to settle back into normal student life. She attended classes and did her work, but her mind was elsewhere. The other students treated her differently now. Some with awe, some with jealousy, some with suspicion. Her professors did not know how to grade someone who had contributed more to human knowledge in 1 week than most scientists did in their entire careers. Maya felt alone in a different way than before. She had been invisible earlier because she was poor and black. Now she was too visible because she was famous. Neither feeling was comfortable. The program she had proposed started to take shape. Maya called it the Perspective Initiative. The goal was simple in concept but complex in execution. Find students from backgrounds that force them to navigate multiple worlds. Give them resources, education, and opportunities. See what they could do. The program targeted students from poor communities, from minority backgrounds, from immigrant families, from anywhere that people learn to think across boundaries. Harvard provided funding, but the initiative operated independently. Maya wanted it separate from institutions that had historically excluded the very people she hoped to help. The first challenge was selection. Maya could not just look at test scores or grades. She needed to understand how applicants saw the world. She designed an interview process that asked questions about bridging differences, about understanding perspectives different from their own, about times they had to navigate between conflicting expectations. Some applicants gave practiced answers clearly designed to impress. Others spoke honestly about their struggles and what those struggles had taught them. Maya chose 20 students for the first group. They came from Detroit, Los Angeles, rural Mississippi, the Bronx, a reservation in New Mexico, and small towns most people had never heard of. The program began in the summer. Maya worked with the students personally, teaching them not mathematics or science but how to recognize and value their own perspectives. She told them that their struggles were not obstacles to overcome, but skills to develop. She showed them how to take the ability to see from multiple viewpoints and apply it to complex problems. The students were skeptical at first. They had been told their whole lives that success meant leaving their backgrounds behind, becoming more like the privileged students who seemed to succeed easily. Maya was telling them the opposite. She said their backgrounds were their strength. One student named Carlos from East Los Angeles understood immediately. He had grown up translating between Spanish and English, between his family's values and American culture, between gang territory and school territory. He had learned to read situations and people with incredible accuracy because mistakes could be dangerous. When Maya showed him a complex engineering problem, Carlos approached it by asking how different groups of people would understand the issue. He solved it in a way that none of the traditional engineering students had considered. His solution was simpler and more effective because it accounted for human factors they had ignored. Another student named Keisha from rural Alabama had a different but equally valuable perspective. She had grown up poor in a community that was deeply religious and traditional. She had also fallen in love with science and mathematics, which created tension with some of her community's beliefs. Keisha had learned to hold seemingly contradictory ideas in her mind at once. She could understand faith and logic, tradition and innovation, without needing one to defeat the other. When presented with a problem involving coalition species with very different belief systems, Keisha created a framework for cooperation that satisfied everyone. Her approach became a model for interspecies negotiations. The students surprised Maya with how quickly they grasped xenomathematics once they understood its basic premise. They had been using similar thinking their entire lives without knowing it had value. Maya taught them how to formalize that intuition, how to turn street smarts into academic frameworks, how to translate lived experience into solutions. By the end of summer, all 20 students had contributed insights to coalition problems that had stumped researchers for years. The initiative was proving Maya's theory. Diversity of perspective was not just nice to have. It was essential for solving complex problems. News of the initiative's success spread through the coalition. Alien species started asking if they could send their own students to learn from Maya's program. The Varathians wanted to know if this approach could be taught to species that had become too uniform in their thinking. The Xanthari were fascinated by how Maya formalized perspective-taking. The Krell wondered if networked species could benefit from understanding disconnected viewpoints. Maya found herself becoming not just a mathematician, but an educator with students from across the galaxy. The program expanded. Maya hired other instructors, mostly people from similar backgrounds to her own who had learned to bridge worlds. They taught classes on Earth and on the Coalition Station. The curriculum covered mathematics, science, and engineering, but always through the lens of multiple perspectives. Students learned to solve problems by first asking how different groups would understand the situation. They practiced stepping outside their own viewpoints. They developed empathy not as a soft skill but as a rigorous intellectual tool. Meanwhile, the 5 Harvard students who had given up in the testing chamber were each dealing with the aftermath in their own ways. Brandon Lee left Harvard and started a company using traditional methods. He was successful by normal standards, but Maya heard he was bitter about the whole experience. Katie Morgan stayed at Harvard and threw herself into research. She published several papers, but they were incremental work, nothing groundbreaking. Daniel Price reached out to Maya and asked if he could join the initiative as a student. He wanted to learn what he had missed. Maya accepted him, and Daniel proved to be a dedicated learner once he set aside his ego. Christopher and Amanda had the hardest time. They had been groomed for success since birth. Their families had expected them to achieve great things. Instead, they had failed publicly on a galactic stage. Christopher went into therapy to work through the shame and eventually found peace. He became a high school teacher, deciding that helping others succeed mattered more than his own achievements. Amanda struggled with depression for months but eventually wrote a memoir about the experience. She talked honestly about privilege, about assumptions, about learning humility. The book became required reading in many schools. Maya watched all of this with mixed feelings. She had not intended to destroy anyone's confidence or career. She had just solved a problem that needed solving. But she understood that her success had forced uncomfortable truths into the light. The systems that rewarded certain types of people while ignoring others were not just unfair. They were also inefficient. They were leaving brilliant minds undeveloped because those minds did not fit traditional patterns. If humanity wanted to thrive in the galaxy, it needed to value all kinds of intelligence and perspective. By the end of her first year running the initiative, Maya had trained over 100 students. Each one brought unique insights born from navigating their own complex worlds. They were solving problems in medicine, engineering, communication, and diplomacy. They were changing how humanity operated, and they were showing the coalition that Earth's strength came not from conformity, but from the beautiful, messy diversity that the rest of the galaxy found so confusing. 2 years after solving the impossible equation, Maya stood in the Coalition Assembly Hall watching as Earth received full voting rights in galactic governance. It was a huge moment for humanity. Most species took centuries to achieve this status. Earth was doing it in just 22 years of membership. The Coalition Chancellor, a being made of pure energy who spoke through controlled vibrations, credited humanity's rapid advancement to their unique ability to bridge perspectives and solve problems others could not. Maya felt proud, but also aware of how much work remained. Earth was still divided by the same old problems. Racism, poverty, inequality, all of it continued. The success of a few individuals like her had not fixed the structural issues that kept millions of people from reaching their potential. She thought about her old neighborhood in Detroit. Yes, she had made it out and done something amazing. But what about the hundreds of other smart kids still there with no path forward? Her success meant nothing if it was just an exception, rather than the beginning of real change. The Coalition had noticed this too. Several species approached Earth's government with concerns about internal human conflicts. How could humanity claim to understand diverse perspectives when they still struggled with diversity among themselves? The Varathians were particularly blunt about it. Chrysalix told Maya directly that humans had potential but also contradictions. They could think across species boundaries yet failed to think across their own cultural ones. If Earth wanted true respect in the galaxy, it needed to solve its own problems first. Maya knew Crystallix was right. She also knew that solving human problems was harder than solving alien ones. The equation on the Coalition station had been difficult, but it was ultimately neutral. It did not threaten anyone's power or privilege. Fixing inequality on Earth meant confronting systems that benefited some people at the expense of others. Those who benefited would not give up their advantages easily. Maya had seen this at Harvard, in politics, in every institution she encountered. Change was not just intellectually challenging. It was socially and politically dangerous. Still, she had to try. Maya used her influence to push for changes in education policy. She argued that schools should teach perspective-taking as a core skill alongside reading and mathematics. Students should learn to understand viewpoints different from their own, not as a diversity exercise but as essential intellectual training. The resistance was immediate and fierce. Some people accused her of pushing a political agenda. Others claimed she was trying to make students feel guilty about their backgrounds. Maya expected these attacks, but they still hurt. She found allies in unexpected places. Some of the alien species offered to help. The Zinthari had experience with educational reform across their many colony worlds. The Krell understood network effects in social systems. Even the Vorathians, despite their bluntness, shared insights about how rigid systems could be transformed. Maya learned that humanity's problems were not unique. Every species had gone through similar struggles when joining the Coalition. The difference was that humans were going through it publicly, with the whole galaxy watching. The Perspective Initiative continued to grow. Maya now had partnerships with 30 universities and 200 schools. Students from the program were entering fields across society. Some became scientists and engineers. Others became teachers, social workers, politicians, artists. What united them was their ability to see problems from multiple angles and find creative solutions. They were starting to change institutions from within. It was slow work, but Maya could see the impact building. One of her former students, a young woman named Lisa from Appalachia, became the youngest member of Congress. Lisa had grown up in poverty in a region that most coastal elites ignored or mocked. She understood both rural conservative values and progressive urban ideals. She could talk to coal miners and climate scientists with equal respect. In Congress, Lisa started building coalitions that crossed traditional party lines. She found common ground on issues by showing people how their different perspectives could work together, rather than against each other. Politicians who had been enemies for decades started having productive conversations because Lisa showed them how. Another student named Jin from San Francisco's Chinatown became a leading AI researcher. Jin had navigated between Chinese and American cultures his whole life. He understood how different cultural assumptions shape technology design. When major tech companies kept creating AI systems that worked well for some groups but failed for others, Jin showed them the problem. Their teams were too uniform in perspective. They built technology that reflected only their own worldview. Jin developed frameworks for inclusive AI design that required input from diverse perspectives during every stage of development. His work became industry standard. Maya watched her students succeed and felt something she had not expected. She felt less alone. For years she had been the exception, the one who made it out, the rare success story, but now there were dozens, then hundreds of people like her making their own paths. They were not exceptions anymore. They were becoming a movement. The idea that diversity of perspective was a strength rather than a problem was spreading. It was still controversial and faced plenty of resistance, but it was gaining ground. The coalition took notice of these changes. Earth started receiving requests to help mediate disputes between other species. When the Varathians and the Xanthari had a trade disagreement that neither side could resolve, they asked for a human negotiator. The person chosen was one of Maya's students who understood both crystalline logic and fluid thinking. She found a solution in 3 days that had eluded both species for months. Similar requests followed. Humans became known as the bridge species, the ones who could understand and translate between groups in conflict. This reputation brought both opportunities and dangers. Some species welcomed human involvement. Others resented it, seeing humans as upstarts who had gotten lucky. There were incidents where human diplomats were attacked or sabotaged. Earth's enemies in the coalition, species that felt threatened by humanity's rapid rise, started working together to undermine human influence. Maya received death threats regularly. Some came from aliens who hated humanity. Others came from humans who hated what she represented. Maya's family worried about her constantly. Her mother called every week begging her to be careful. Her father sent her news articles about anti-human violence in distant star systems. They were proud of what she had accomplished, but they were also terrified. Maya tried to reassure them, but she knew the dangers were real. She had changed too much too fast. She had upset power structures, both human and alien. People who benefited from the old ways wanted her gone. Despite the threats, Maya kept pushing forward. She expanded the initiative to include students from other coalition species. She created exchange programs where humans learned from aliens and aliens learned from humans. She published papers on xenomathematics that became required reading across the galaxy. She advised Earth's government on coalition policy. She testified before the Assembly on issues of interspecies cooperation. She was exhausted and constantly stressed, but she could not stop. There was too much at stake. One night, working late in her office at Harvard, Maya looked out the window at the stars. Somewhere up there was the coalition station where she had solved the impossible equation. That moment had changed her life and set her on this path. She sometimes wondered what would have happened if she had not raised her hand that day. If she had accepted failure like the others and gone home quietly. Her life would be simpler, safer, more peaceful. But she would not have helped all the students she had helped. She would not have shown the galaxy what humanity could be. Maya thought about the title that had hung over that challenge. Top Harvard students gave up. Then a scholarship student raised her hand. It had seemed like a story about one moment, one person, one achievement. But it was really about what came after, about whether that moment would be an exception or the beginning of change. Maya was trying to make it the beginning. Whether she would succeed was still unknown, but she knew she had to try. The crisis came without warning in Maya's 3rd year of running the initiative. A coalition exploration vessel disappeared near the edge of mapped space. The ship carried a crew of 30 individuals from 7 different species, including 3 humans. Search efforts found nothing. After 2 weeks, the coalition declared the crew lost. It was a tragedy, but space was dangerous and ships were sometimes lost. Then 2 more vessels vanished in the same region. Now it was a crisis. The Coalition Assembly convened an emergency session. Military forces were put on alert. Scientists analyzed the area where the ships disappeared, but found no obvious dangers. No spatial anomalies, no hostile species, no weapon signatures. The ships simply stopped transmitting and were never seen again. Panic began to spread through the coalition. If ships could vanish without explanation, nowhere was safe. Trade routes were abandoned. Species started pulling back to their home systems. The unity that had taken millennia to build was fracturing in weeks. Maya watched the crisis unfold with growing concern. The coalition's top scientists and military strategists were working the problem, but they were getting nowhere. Each species approached it from their own perspective. The Varathians saw it as a mathematical puzzle about spatial mechanics. The Zenthari thought it was a natural phenomenon like a current or tide in space. The Krell believed it might be a communication problem where the ships were intact, but unable to transmit. None of these theories led anywhere useful. Ships kept disappearing and nobody knew why. Then Maya had a thought that made her sit up straight in her chair. What if the problem required the same kind of thinking as the navigation equation? What if understanding what was happening required seeing it from multiple perspectives at once? She immediately contacted Crystallix and requested permission to assemble a team. The Varathian elder was skeptical. This was a military and scientific emergency, not a mathematics problem. But Crystallix also remembered who Maya was and what she had accomplished. Permission was granted. Maya moved quickly. She gathered a team of 20 people, all graduates of the Perspective Initiative. They came from Earth, from various coalition species, from backgrounds that had taught them to think across boundaries. She brought them to the coalition station and gave them everything the official investigation teams had gathered. Then she asked them to stop thinking about solving the problem and start thinking about understanding it. What if the answer was not in better sensors or weapons, but in seeing what everyone else was missing? The team worked for 3 days reviewing data and discussing theories. Unlike the official teams, they did not split along species lines. A human student worked with a Zenthari analyzing fluid dynamic patterns. A Varathian collaborated with a Krell on information network theories. Maya had specifically chosen people who could think like multiple species at once. They looked at the evidence not from one perspective but from all of them simultaneously. Slowly, a picture began to emerge. The region where ships disappeared was not empty space. It was a boundary between different types of spacetime that multiple species perceived differently. The Varathians saw it as stable because their crystalline math showed structural integrity. The Zenthari saw it as safe because their fluid dynamics showed smooth flow. The Krell detected no network disruptions, so they thought communication was fine. Each species saw part of the truth but missed the whole. The boundary was simultaneously stable, flowing, and communicating. But it was also doing something else that no single perspective could detect. Maya's team realized that the boundary was shifting between states in ways that matched different species movements through space. When a Varathian ship approached, the boundary stabilized in response. When a Zenthari ship came near, it became more fluid. It was adapting to each ship's navigation method. But when ships with mixed crews tried to pass through, the boundary became confused. It tried to be multiple states at once. The result was catastrophic. The ships were not destroyed. They were caught between incompatible states of reality, existing but unable to exist in any single coherent way. The discovery was terrifying and hopeful at the same time. Terrifying because it meant dozens of crew members were trapped in a state between realities. Hopeful because if Maya's team was right, there might be a way to bring them back. They just needed to create a navigation method that unified all perspectives the way Maya's original framework had. But this was more complex. It was not just about calculating paths through space. It was about rescuing beings from a place that existed differently for each species. Maya took the findings to the assembly. The response was mixed. Some species believed her immediately, especially those familiar with xenomathematics. Others thought it was speculation based on incomplete data. The military commanders wanted proof before they risked more ships. The scientists wanted more time to study the phenomenon. Maya understood their caution, but she also knew that people were trapped and suffering. Every day they waited made rescue less likely. She made a proposal that shocked everyone. She would lead a rescue mission personally. She would take a ship with a crew trained in multi-perspective thinking directly to the boundary. They would use a modified version of the Johnson framework to navigate the shifting spacetime. If her theory was correct, they could retrieve the lost crews. If she was wrong, they would be lost too. It was a huge risk. Maya was humanity's most valuable mind. Losing her would be a disaster for Earth and the Coalition. The debate raged for hours. Earth's government initially refused to allow it. Too dangerous, too important, too much at stake. But Maya argued that this was exactly what the Perspective Initiative had been training people for. Problems that seemed impossible from one viewpoint became solvable when seen from many. If she was not willing to risk herself for that principle, why should anyone else believe in it? Eventually, reluctantly, permission was granted. Maya assembled her crew carefully. She chose 8 people, including herself, representing 5 species and a dozen different backgrounds. There was Carlos from East Los Angeles, who had proven brilliant at reading complex situations. There was Keisha from Alabama, who could hold contradictory ideas in her mind simultaneously. There was a young Varathian named Shardlight, who had studied at the Initiative and learned fluid thinking. There was a Zenthari called Ripple, who understood crystalline logic. Each crew member could think like at least 2 species. Together, they covered every major perspective in the Coalition. They spent 1 week training and modifying the ship. The navigation system was upgraded to handle multi-state space. The sensors were calibrated to detect reality shifts. The crew practiced working together, learning each other's thought patterns, becoming a unified mind that could perceive space in all the ways it could be perceived. Maya felt confident in the team, but also scared. She had solved the impossible equation from the safety of a testing chamber. Now she was betting her life and the lives of her crew on whether her theories would work in actual space. The night before launch, Maya called her mother. Her parents were terrified and begged her not to go. But her mother also said something that Maya needed to hear. She said that Maya had always been someone who raised her hand when others gave up. It was who she was at her core. Her mother had watched her do it in school, in college, at the Coalition station. This rescue mission was just another example. Maya was never going to be someone who played it safe. Her mother accepted that even though it broke her heart. Maya thanked her and promised to come home safe. She meant it, but she also knew promises like that were sometimes impossible to keep. Space was dangerous, and what she was attempting had never been tried. But the alternative was leaving people trapped in a nightmare between realities. Maya could not do that. So she would raise her hand one more time and see what happened. The next morning, her ship launched toward the boundary. The galaxy watched and waited. The journey to the boundary took 4 days using conventional navigation. Maya's crew spent the time preparing mentally and emotionally for what they would face. They practiced shifting between different ways of perceiving space. They meditated on what it meant to think like multiple species simultaneously. They became more than a crew. They became a collective consciousness capable of seeing reality through many lenses at once. By the time they reached the boundary region, they were as ready as anyone could be. The first sign of the boundary appeared on their sensors as a shimmer in space. To Maya's eyes, it looked like heat waves rising from summer pavement. But when Carlos looked at the same readings, he saw it as a wall of shifting colors. Keisha perceived it as music with clashing rhythms. Shardlight described it as a crystal that could not decide its structure. Ripple said it was water freezing and melting at the same time. Each crew member saw something different, because each was perceiving reality slightly differently. The boundary was all of these things and none of them. Maya activated the modified navigation system. The Johnson framework began calculating paths through the boundary by accounting for all possible perceptions of space. The ship moved forward slowly and carefully. The moment they touched the boundary, everything changed. Reality became fluid and uncertain. Maya could see the ship's interior, but also see through it to impossible geometries beyond. Time felt stretched and compressed simultaneously. Her crew members looked solid and translucent at the same moment. It was deeply disorienting, and she understood immediately why ships had been lost here. Any vessel navigating with a single perspective would simply break apart when faced with this. But Maya's crew held together by thinking as one while remaining many. Each person maintained their unique perspective while also joining with the others. The ship existed in multiple states because they accepted that existence could be multiple states. They did not fight against the boundary's nature. They flowed with it while maintaining their own coherence. The modified navigation system worked, guiding them deeper into the impossible space. The readings showed the lost ships ahead, caught in layers of reality they could not escape. The first rescue was the hardest. The ship they found was a Varathian science vessel that had been missing for 5 weeks. The crew was alive but trapped in a crystalline state that prevented them from moving or communicating normally. Maya's team had to match the boundary state precisely to make contact. It required Shardlight to think entirely like a Varathian, while the rest of the crew maintained other perspectives. When they achieved the right balance, the trapped crew could be brought aboard and gradually shifted back to normal space. It took 6 hours and left everyone exhausted. But it worked. They found the second ship the next day. This one carried a mixed crew like Maya's own, and they were trapped in a more complex state. Each crew member existed in a different layer of reality, unable to communicate with each other or navigate home. Maya's team had to carefully extract each person by matching their specific state of being. It was delicate work that required constant adjustment. Carlos proved invaluable here, reading the subtle shifts in the boundary and guiding the others. After 12 hours of intense effort, the second crew was saved. The third and final ship was the exploration vessel that had started the crisis. It had been trapped the longest, and the crew was in the worst condition. They existed in a state between all realities, unable to fully be anything. Some had started to lose their sense of self, forgetting which species they belonged to or whether they were even alive. Maya's crew worked for 20 hours straight to bring them back. Keisha's ability to hold contradictions helped her connect with crew members who no longer understood coherent reality. One by one, the lost explorers were retrieved and restored. When the last person was safely aboard, Maya gave the order to return to normal space. The journey back through the boundary was easier now that they understood it. Within hours, they emerged into regular spacetime with all 3 lost crews safe. The Coalition fleet waiting outside erupted in celebration. Ships from dozens of species transmitted messages of joy and relief. Maya had done it. She had proven that multi-perspective thinking could solve even the most impossible problems. The return to the Coalition station was triumphant. Maya and her crew were celebrated as heroes across the galaxy. But more importantly, the rescue had demonstrated something crucial. The Perspective Initiative was not just about education or mathematics. It was about survival in a diverse universe. Species that could think across boundaries would thrive. Those that could not would face increasing danger as they encountered phenomena beyond their limited perspectives. The Coalition began to require multi-perspective training for all crews operating in deep space. Earth's position in the galactic community changed fundamentally. Humanity was no longer seen as the newest or weakest member. They were recognized as having a unique and vital contribution. The ability to bridge perspectives born from Earth's messy diversity was now understood as a strategic advantage. Other species began studying human culture to understand how such diversity could be maintained without falling into chaos. Some succeeded better than others, but the effort itself showed that humanity had something valuable to teach. Maya returned to Earth different from when she had left. The scared scholarship student who had raised her hand 3 years ago was gone. In her place was a leader who had proven her theories with her life. She continued running the Perspective Initiative, but with renewed confidence and support. Funding flowed in from across the Coalition. Students came from every member species. The program became a model for education throughout the galaxy. The 5 Harvard students who had given up during the original test lived different lives now. Brandon had made peace with his failure and started teaching perspective-taking to business leaders. Katie focused on mentoring students from disadvantaged backgrounds. Daniel worked alongside Maya at the initiative. Christopher found happiness as a teacher. Amanda became an advocate for educational reform. They had each learned from their failure and found ways to contribute. Maya stayed in touch with all of them. She bore no grudges, and they had each grown from the experience. Maya's mother asked her once if she regretted anything. Did she wish she had stayed home, stayed safe, stayed invisible? Maya thought about it and said no. Raising her hand that day in the testing chamber had been terrifying. But it had also been necessary. Someone needed to try when everyone else had given up. That was the lesson she tried to teach her students. Not that they should be reckless or seek danger, but that they should trust themselves and their unique perspectives, especially when others said something was impossible. The galaxy was vast and full of problems that seemed unsolvable. But Maya had learned that most impossible problems were only impossible from one point of view. Change the perspective and suddenly a path forward appeared. This was humanity's gift and burden. Humans could see from many angles because they had learned to survive in a world of differences. Other species found this trait confusing or inefficient. Humans themselves often failed to appreciate it. But Maya knew its value because she had lived it. 10 years after solving the equation, Maya stood before the Coalition Assembly to receive the highest honor any being could earn. The Crystal of Unity was given only to individuals who had fundamentally advanced the cause of galactic cooperation. Maya accepted it with humility and grace. She thanked her crew, her students, her family, and everyone who had supported her, but she also said something that made the entire assembly pause. She said that she was not special or unique. There were thousands, maybe millions of people across the galaxy who had learned to think across boundaries because they lived on boundaries. Most would never be recognized or honored. Many would struggle their whole lives without ever getting a chance to show what they could do. The real work was not celebrating the few who made it, but creating systems that found and developed all the others. Until then, the galaxy would waste most of its potential. It was a challenge that made some assembly members uncomfortable. But it was also truth. The coalition began to change slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. New programs spread across member species. Old barriers began to fall. It would take generations, but progress was happening. Maya had started something that would outlive her by centuries. She thought back to that moment in the testing chamber when she raised her hand. It had felt small at the time, almost insignificant. Just one student trying when others had given up. But that small moment had rippled outward in ways she never imagined. It had changed her life, changed Earth's place in the galaxy, and started changing how species thought about diversity and perspective. All because a scholarship student from Detroit saw what others missed and was brave enough to say so. The title that had hung over her life all these years finally made sense to her. Top Harvard students gave up, then a scholarship student raised her hand. It was not really about Harvard or scholarships. It was about the moment when someone decides to try despite the odds, despite the fear, despite everyone else giving up. Maya had been that person once. Now she spent her life finding others who could be that person too. The galaxy needed them. It always would.